This is a 2005 BMW 325 Ci. The common problem is that these latches break right here. See, this one is cracked. This disconnects and it doesn't allow this mechanism to push and activate the latch. The principle is that this bar right here moves back and forth from this jack screw, and as it pushes it back and forth, it activates this latch. So what we're going to do is replace this piece with an aftermarket piece. BMW doesn't sell those individually, but they can be bought on eBay and other places for about $40 for the kit. First thing we'll do is disconnect this drive shaft. In order to disconnect it, you can pull back on it and flex it and it pops off. And lay that off to the side, and then we're going to disconnect these 4 bolts right here, here, and right there. These are T30 Torx. We're going to remove all 4 of these. Once they're loose, just pick this up. You can pop them out from the bottom side, or just pluck them out with a little magnet. Next, we're going to remove the snap ring that retains the bearing on the jack screw. If it's not oriented correctly where you can grab it with your snap ring pliers, you can pull one ear and loosen it and yank it around into position where you can get your snap ring pliers on it. Squeeze the ears together. Carefully, I said carefully, remove the snap ring. Next, we're going to pick this up to get to the underside where you see that little screw right there. That's a T15 Torx. So once the screw is loosened, pull it out by hand. It's a T15 Torx. Then there's a plastic guide plate under here. We'll pop this little guide plate out. Pull it out just like that. The next step is to remove this jack screw. We're going to give ourselves some room over here by turning it. You may have to put an Allen wrench in here and turn it if it's difficult to turn. Once you get some distance here, you can push forward on it. Since the snap ring is out, the bearing pops out from its retainer. Continue to turn this. The object is to completely remove the jack screw from this plastic piece. At this point, you can pull back as you unscrew this. The bearing will not go further than this because it interferes right here. A 5mm Allen can be put in to the end, especially if it has this ball end on it, so that you can drive it at a slight angle. Continue to turn this until it's threaded completely out of the plastic piece. Okay, so we're going to continue removing the jack screw. When you get to this point, you're going to feel like there's not enough room to get this out of this block. So you can pull on this a little bit And if you have to, you can take a pair of pliers like this and squeeze this over. Then you will have enough room to get the guide section out. At this point, you can completely remove the jack screw, bearing, and the friction washer. Once the jack screw is out, push back on the arm, lift it up out of a small bushing that's in here, and work it out and up and out of the mechanism. This is the broken sliding arm. You can see that it has completely separated, even though the JB Weld trick was applied, but it didn't work. Some other alternative is to drill 2 holes here, about 3/16 holes. You have to line them up just right so that they go in here and right there, so that they would go through the holes in the metal here. Put about a number 10 screw and washers and nuts on it and squeeze it together. In addition to the JB Weld, the screws would probably make a pretty viable repair if you don't want to replace the pieces. Okay, so here's our new piece. We're going to apply a little bit of lithium grease to that surface and the surface where it slides on here. And this part goes down inside of this sliding bushing. Assemble the piece like this under the roller. Guide that into the bushing. At this point, pull the sliding bar all the way back so that you have no gap left here. That's the only way you're going to get the jack screw back in. Put the jack screw back through the bearing guide, and then this unthreaded piece starts to guide itself into the plastic. Screw it in and take up whatever slack you can. Once you get the thread started in the plastic guide, you can move this back and forth to find your sweet spot to where it wants to thread in easily. When you get to the point where you can put the Allen wrench back in it, then start to turn it and thread it back through the guide block. Continue turning with the Allen wrench to feed the bolt, the jack screw bolt, through the guide block. You'll see the bearing is getting closer. When this angle gets too severe, then stop and guide this inside of this end support guide and drive it from the end with the other part of the Allen wrench. At this point, you'll see that the bearing and the unthreaded portion of the jack screw will begin to enter into the bushing area. Make sure that these are aligned and that the wavy washer underneath is not cocked and preventing it from going in. And you'll see on every turn now it pulls that bearing in farther. If you get to the point where it feels tight and it's not turning freely anymore and the bearing is still sticking out, most likely the washer underneath it is not seated correctly. If this happens, back it off and make sure the washer is seated correctly. Once you know the washer is in there straight, if necessary, you can give this a little squeeze. Squeeze it in far enough so that the groove for the snap ring is fully exposed so that the snap ring will drop in the hole without having to fight it. Okay, the next trick is getting the snap ring back in. It's best to try to get it in exactly straight, but sometimes easier to try to get the bottom piece in first. You can actually do this without snap ring pliers if you're good at finding stuff after it goes flying across the shop. Once you get the snap ring in, take a small screwdriver and push on it to make sure it's fully seated into the snap ring groove. It should look like this. You can see how the snap ring ears are about a 1/4 inch gap between them. If it's closer than that, that means the snap ring has not fully seated into the groove. So you need to squeeze the shaft back a little bit with the pliers and then take a screwdriver and push in on the snap ring until it fully seats. At this point, drive the jack screw back all the way back to the other direction so that there's about 3 threads showing in here. That was the initial starting position. It should look like this. At this point, we're going to turn it back upside down as much as we can and put the plastic guide plate and screw back in. You can't do it before this point because as this mechanism comes back, this forces this over so that the part that sticks down interferes with the lower plate. So it will only go in this one position. Okay, so that's what it looks like before you put the guide plate on it. Place the plastic guide back over the protruding bushing. Slip the guide plate over. Should look like this. Then replace the 15 torque screw. Drive this in only with the tip by hand because it's a small insert in there and could be easily damaged. So just go finger tight, then a small snug with a ratchet. Here's a little update or correction. When I said that the small T15 screw threaded into an insert, that turned out to be not correct. It actually threads into this metal arm and it's a big piece of it, so you don't have to worry about an insert pulling out. However, it is still a small screw and so the torque on it is going to be relatively minor, so still be careful. So it should look like this. I'd say the screw should be maybe 15 or so inch-pounds, no more. Then put the mounting screws back in, tighten them up. And connect the drive shaft. Flex it, place it on the splines. At this point, look at the gap in here. You have about 3 threads. Compare it to the gap on the other side. They should be the same. Now, if you're mad and cussing about that procedure, you'll really be happy to know that that was the easy side. The other side, the driver's side, has the two limit switches that you have to deal with. These are called Hall effect switches. They act like a micro switch, but there's no moving parts. It's a magnetic field that's generated, and as this piece right here moves over the magnetic field, there's a little tiny metal block in here, which, by the way, doesn't come installed in the new kits. In order to get that out, what I did was sanded it down on the belt sander till I just saw a spark and stopped, and then sanded this side down, and I extracted the little metal piece. Then you have to custom fit it in there because it won't just press in. I was afraid that if I forced it in, it would break the new plastic block. So I had to custom fit the little metal block so that it fit in there properly. Then as you're putting this together, not only do you have to do the procedure from the other side, but there should be a tiny gap uh, here between the magnetic piece and the metal. And I have a feeler gauge right now. I've got about 3 thousandths in there. When I first put it together, since these are not BMW parts, they didn't have the gaps exactly right. So I had to take it apart a few times and file the little piece of metal down so that I had the proper gap in there. If you don't do that, then this piece is going to wipe out the top of the magnetic piece and tear it to pieces because there's not enough room for it to slide over the top of it. So beware of that and be prepared to do a little fiddly bench work and make sure that you have the gap in there, because if you don't want to go through all this and then have it wipe out your little Hall effect sensor, and you'll be starting in on a new problem. So this is the small piece of plastic where the metal piece goes in that trips the Hall effect sensor. And to get it out, I sanded that surface right there till I just saw a spark and stopped. And then sanded this surface right here until I just saw a spark and stopped. So it had little tiny mark on the piece of metal, so I knew what orientation it went in. You can look at the threaded portion here and put it in exactly the same way. Just make sure that it is flush and doesn't stick out at all. The dimensions on my little piece of metal were 0.315 on one side and 0.312 on the other. That should be it. Got the new pieces in there and everything should be working now.